today. I may give just another minute or two for people to start joining. And in the meantime, you can feel free to use the chat feature to identify yourself and your institution. And if there are any other attendees with you, I imagine a lot of us are remote, as often are, but go ahead and put that in the chat box. But let's get started. I am Jamie Patrick Burns. I'm the digital archivist at the State Archives of North Carolina. Thank you for being here today. Just a few quick notes before we get started. This is our final webinar for the spring 2020 SERI series before we take a break for the summer. Tune in again in September for our fall slate, and please feel free to let us know if there's any topics you'd like to hear about. And I'm just going to draw your attention to a few of our online resources. We have a series of 6 videos on managing digital content over time, and we also have an FAQ video on bit rot. And we are actively working on some more videos to make available to you. And next, I will introduce today's speakers. So we've got quite a panel lined up for you today. Alan Ramsey joined the Connecticut State Library staff in 2010 as Government Records Archivist. He became Assistant State Archivist in 2013 and oversees the State Archives' acquisition, arrangement, description, and preservation of state and local government records and non-governmental records of enduring value pertaining to the history and heritage of Connecticut. Alan is a co-chair of the SERI Steering Committee. Christian Skipper is the Regulations and Records Manager for the Maryland Department of Transportation. Under the guidance of the Records Officer, Christian developed the department's records retention and management policy in 2019 and currently coordinates the implementation of records retention schedules across 7 transportation business units. Nick Connizzo is currently project manager for CoSA's 2020 research project, investigating best practices and tools in electronic records transfers. He's been a digital archivist for nearly a decade, first with George Washington University and then with the state of Vermont, and has been co-chair of the Tools and Resources Subcommittee since 2017. Kathryn Baringer is the Director of Appraisal and Description at the Maryland State Archives, where she has worked for 14 years. And last but not least, Bonnie Weddle is the coordinator of the Electronic Records Unit at the New York State Archives. She oversees the preservation of state agency electronic records of enduring value and the archival capture of state government websites. She's also the co-chair of the SERI Education and Programming Subcommittee. And before I turn it over, I'll note that any questions will be held until the end, but please feel free to enter questions into the chat box at any time. And at this point, I will hand it over to Alan.
All right, thank you, Jamie. So for today's agenda, we're going to go over what is overview of SERI, State Electronic Records Initiative, and its purpose. Then I'm going to talk about the steering committee. Then Christian is going to talk about the Advocacy and Outreach Subcommittee. Bonnie and Kathryn are going to talk about the Education and Programming Subcommittee. And then Nick is going to talk about Tools and Resources. And then we're going to have time for discussion, questions, feedback about the State Electronic Records Initiative. So that's our agenda for the day. So I'm going to start with an overview. And I was looking back in the a national risk, the state of the state electronic records report, to kind of put together some of the history. And there's way more history than we could cover in an hour, so I'm not going to go way too in history, but I'm going to cover some highlights. And so I found this part of the beginning of the national risk report to kind of help frame sort of where we've been and sort of where we wanted to go. And so the disparity of electronic records management programs in the states, including whether state archival agencies were involved in managing the entire records life cycle or only in the preservation of archival records, and the lack of funding in most states, concerned the Council of State Archivists leadership and membership. CoSA embraced the challenge of assisting all states and territories and the District of Columbia in improving and/or creating electronic records management and digital preservation capabilities. With that strategic decision, CoSA began planning SERI in 2011. So what is SERI? SERI is the State Electronic Records Initiative. We really like our acronyms in government. And it was launched by the Council of State Archivists in July of 2011 at its annual meeting in Nashville, Tennessee. Its focus is on improving management, preservation, and access to electronic records in all 56 states, territories, and D.C. This would not be possible without ongoing support and dedication of state archivists, staff, volunteers from state archives and records management programs to really keep things moving in SERI, and the CoSA board, membership, of course, and of course CoSA staff and consultants, especially Michelle Gallinger, who's our coordinator and keeps us on track, and of course our federal granting agencies that have provided funding over the years for the important work that SERI has done and continues to do, IMLS and NHPRC. And of course corporate sponsors who have also helped provide funding, Preservica for training and for research, and this year with our research focus on transfer with Preservica and AVP. So all those together keep SERI moving and providing all of the programming and education and training materials and other things that you've seen out of SERI. So the structure of SERI is there's a steering committee, which is made up of 2 co-chairs. I am one of them. Alejandra Dean is the other one. And the co-chairs of subcommittees, state archivists, state archives and records management staff members, and CoSA staff and consultants. We meet once a month, and hear reports from the subcommittees, which are Advocacy and Outreach, Education and Programming, Tools and Resources, and help talk things through and figure out where everything's going and where we need to go and what our plan of work is. So that's the structure. These are the members, and if I missed anyone, it wasn't intentional, but that gives you an idea of who's on the steering committee. Now just a little bit about looking back. This is electronic records may seem like a new issue, but it's not a new issue. In fact, NARA, which is the National Archives and Records Administration, and state government archives really began evaluating electronic records issues in the 1970s around big data sets and bibliographic data. NHPRC and the Library of Congress National Digital Information Infrastructure Preservation Program, NDIP, funded several electronic records initiatives over the years from 1980s to the early 2000s. So this is not a new issue, but it's been around a while. As I mentioned, the state archivists really started talking about this, for lack of a better word, deluge of electronic records coming, or potentially coming, or where are they? Not as much paper per se may not be coming in, although we still see a lot of paper. But it really began, from 2011 saying we need to do something. It really began with an assessment. So what's going on out there? So there was statistical data compiled by CoSA and talked with and there was some interviews with state archivists that was all compiled and reviewed, and if additional data was needed, for creating or improving their state's electronic records programs. Each state archives and records management program completed a written survey, which kind of goes back to all the data that was sort of being compiled in this phase, to sort of see what's out there and help to figure out, put out a report on phase 1 in early 2012, which revealed over 50% of state and territorial archivists having minimal or non-existent electronic records programs. So there was, with over 50%, there's a lot of work to start tackling electronic records issues in the state government. It then transitioned to phase 2, and phase 2 ran from roughly October 2011 to September 2015. In phase 2, which is planning and action, sort of a planning and action phase, I went back and looked to see what some of the accomplishments, as I say here, this is not exhaustive. There was a lot going on. These are just sort of the highlights. We had the Program for Electronic Records Training Tools and Standards Portal, PERTS portal, which was funded in 2013 by a $150,000 NHGRC grant. We know that today is the Resource Center, but PERTS really started the beginning of the Resource Center, bring together all the different electronic records resources out there, information about electronic records tools, and other information. So that really began that part of it. There was also what's known as the Strategic Training and Education Program, STEP, which was funded in 2013 by a nearly $500,000 MLS grant that helped bring, states had taken the digital preservation capability maturity model, and it helped SERI and CoSA, SERI, determine sort of what state archives are sort of at the beginning and sort of what state archives are advanced, and so that helped to cover institutes which were conducted. Beginner Institute was conducted in 2011, 2012, somewhere in there. In Indianapolis, I should remember because I was there. And then there was Advanced Institutes the following year, one in Richmond, Virginia, and the other in Salt Lake, I believe. And then there was other training webinars, such as this webinar series, some of the webinars which really sprung into this sort of series, and a lot of education, which helped to bring up all the state archives across the states, territories, and DC. As I mentioned, the DPCMM was done in 2012 and 2015. 2015 was sort of at the end of the grant period to sort of see where things were at. And then we've been doing archives, collaborating and cooperating with external strategic stakeholders, Access, which there's a planning grant, and now we're just wrapping up the implementation grant of the Access grant. And then there was a phase 3 of, which we're currently in, which was some reorganization. Instead of 4 subcommittees, it was reorganized to 3 subcommittees. The charges were changed a little bit. There was tasks that we're still working through, even 5 years later. And highlights of phase 3 so far have included the Access planning and planning was in the last phase, but the implementation grant, which you'll see some of the products here, the NASCIO digital, the NASCIO playbook, and co-brand publications with the National Governors Association, National Association of Secretaries of State, and Chief Officers of State Library Agencies, and as I mentioned, NASCIO. The report I was referencing earlier was also written during this period to kind of do that sort of longitudinal, where have we been, what things have been going on, and sort of what are the things to keep thinking about as we move forward. And as another example of things that we've work that's been going on is the Best Practices Guide. series, which we're actually working on the second one right now, which I'm sure Nick will mention later. But the first one was put out on managing digitization projects in 2017. Just a few things when I was putting this together, thinking about and to help us with discussion later, some of the things looking forward. So, continue to engage and foster collaborations both amongst the state archives community and amongst all of the national associations I previously mentioned and others that we may not think about to, really collaborate and to move preservation and access to digital records forward. Of course, sustainability, which is how do we keep these things going. Like I mentioned, without the volunteers, really great work, and CoSA staff and board members, nothing would really move forward. And then, ongoing development, of course, of education programming that really helps staff, state archive staff, management, other stakeholders. So those are a few things I was thinking about as I was putting this together, sort of where we might be going. But this is not exhaustive at all. And then just some of the products that have come out of the Access Grant and some of the other work that we've done. So the NGAs, we've done a co-branded NGA, first step in managing records to transition in and out of for governors, NAS on planning election or preserving electronic records, while transitioning out of office, so some transitioning documentation. With COSLA and NAS, how do you, make sure that the information you see is accurate. The playbook that I mentioned, which was really useful to have a conversation with chief information officers to keep this on their agenda and minds. The best practices guide that I previously mentioned, and then an infographic for the National Risk Report. And the research project that we just wrapped up that's informing our current research project, which is the sort of what is the backlog in state agencies, for electronic records, and a checklist that came out of that can help state archives to sort of approach how to begin to do more transferring in agencies and state IT, and how we can all sort of start to do more of that. So all these reports and things are on the Council of State Archivists website. I urge you to go take a look at them, to share them. They're there for everyone to use and to help you do what you need to do. And next, we're going to hear from the co-chairs of the SERI subcommittees, first Advocacy and Outreach, and then Education and Programming, and then Tools and Resources. So now I'm going to pass it to Christian.
Shucks, I was very briefly muted there, as I think we've all experienced in webinars and teleconferences over the past couple of months. I am, as Alan said, Christian Skipper at the Maryland Department of Transportation and formerly of the Maryland State Archives, as it were. So I have quite a bit of experience with electronic records over the past decade or so, and joined the Advocacy and Outreach subcommittee. I actually don't recall. I want to say it was circa 2017, but it's been a while, and it's been a hoot working with my co-chair, Patsy Mitchell, to try to improve advocacy and outreach for electronic records nationwide. So let's see if I can adjust this. Here we go. All right. So just a brief introduction to the concept of the Advocacy and Outreach Subcommittee. Basically, what we were founded to do was to be kind of both public-facing and inward-facing with regard to electronic records advocacy, which is to say that we try to make the public more broadly aware of why digital records matter and what's going on in the world of digital records, and how government agencies are being kept accountable. Shucks, of course, my cell phone would ring just while I'm giving this talk. Isn't that the way? Anyway, with regard to the public side, making the public aware of the importance of digital records and what's going on with them in the industry, but also internally at government and other agencies and institutions, trying to make employees aware of what resources exist for them, as well as how to make the case to their supervisors, their stakeholders, their various funding sources, why it's important to prioritize electronic records management. So that's kind of the two-pronged approach that the Advocacy and Outreach Subcommittee takes within the broader State Electronic Records Initiative framework. To that end, today I'd like to highlight just a few of the projects that we have been engaged in the past and are currently engaged in. One of these that has been a really big success over the past few years is the State Electronic Records Program highlights. And these are all stored on the Council of State Archivists website under the SERI portion of that site. But these are, in some ways, kind of informal case studies that give a look into electronic records programs and projects across the country. And during 2017 to 2019, we were putting these out on a roughly quarterly basis. Just a couple of these that I'd like to highlight for you include things like legislative recording at the Tennessee State Library and Archives, a look inside Georgia's virtual vault, governor records, governor transitions, both in Nevada as well as taking care of governor records elsewhere, and even down into things like web archiving. So this really gets into, really kind of the nitty-gritty of programs and projects at various state archives and libraries, and gives readers a look into what other institutions are doing and how they might apply lessons learned at their agency. For the last few years, we have also been providing both promotional materials and webinars and programming for Electronic Records Day. The promotional material gets stored on, again, the SERI website and happily is pretty evergreen. They tend to be pretty high-level summaries that are relevant to quite a wide variety of agencies and institutions. But also generally, we work to publish either a new document for Electronic Records Day, which is October 10th of each year, or provide some kind of live programming. For example, Chris Stenson and I, a couple years ago, ran an Electronic Records Day webinar that was very well attended and successful, and gave a lot of folks some information to review. We also work to increase the visibility of content available on the Resource Center, and you're going to be hearing a little bit more about the Resource Center later on from Nick, I believe. But the Resource Center is effectively a repository for quite a bit of electronic records resources that have been gathered by SERI. And the Advocacy and Outreach Subcommittee works to make, again, both the public and folks within the records management and archival industry aware of what kind of resources are out there and available for them to apply at their institution. To that end, we work to publicize content through the social media arms of the Council of State Archivists. One of the folks on our subcommittee works to shepherd along information and resources to Twitter, to Facebook, and to Instagram accounts associated with the Council of State Archivists. And at this point in 2020, especially because everybody is sort of stuck at home, not everybody, but quite a few workers are stuck at home, we have redoubled our efforts to provide links to resources that are especially relevant to folks engaged in telework. So we're working to publicize those via the various social media channels of the Council of State Archivists. Finally, we have contributed to a number of the reports that the Council of State Archivists have published over the last few years. In particular, the State of State Electronic Records report. We did quite a bit of editorial work on, and we're responsible for just being one of the many subcommittees that contributes to reviewing that content and adding our own input on it. I don't want to steal the thunder of the Tools and Resources Subcommittee a little bit later on, but another one of the major efforts that Advocacy and Outreach has been working on this year is contributing to a collaboration that produces YouTube videos. But I will certainly let Nick speak to that. That's a real quick overview of what the Advocacy and Outreach Subcommittee does. At this point, I would like to forward along the presentation to Kathryn, and I'm happy to take any questions at the end. Thank you.
Thank you, Christian. I am going to talk about the Education and Programming Subcommittee, of which I am co-chair with Bonnie Weddle. Our committee has a number of goals. We want to facilitate sharing of advice and assistance from people's experience with electronic records in any way or format that we can. Just one of the ways that we do this is to encourage electronic records-related proposals at conferences and meetings. We also create electronic records training in various formats. We collaborate with the other subcommittees. As you noticed from Christian's description, a lot of these projects cross over subcommittee lines, so we do a lot of collaborating on the same project, and we also look to develop or promote any of the CoSA or SERI programming. In doing all this, we have run into some challenges. One of our biggest challenges is finding topics and developing training that will serve such a diverse audience as the one which we serve. Electronic records creation and management has so many jobs associated with it, whether it be technical or administrative or related to creation or preservation or access. Our audience also has a very wide range of skill levels. So we try in our training to have both basic introductory level training as well as more advanced specific training. We also try hard to make sure that we're accurately describing our offerings so that people will be able to identify which programs would be useful to them. And we are figuring this out as we go, so we welcome any suggestions that you have on what specific topics we should be covering or general categories of topics. And we would also be happy to hear any suggestions you have on how to better classify and describe our offerings so that you can best find those trainings that serve you best. Because our goal in this webinar was not just to tell you what we're doing, but to open up that conversation so that you could tell us what we should be doing. So that's what we're trying to do. How do we go about doing that? Well, our main types of projects are webinars, like this one, training material of various formats, such as videos, and also we do efforts to identify and serve specific user communities. So to talk about these projects in a little more detail, I'm going to hand it over to my co-chair, Bonnie Weddle.
Okay, thank you, Kathryn. As Kathryn mentioned, one of the things that we do is organize webinars. We develop 2 series, one webinar per month, one series in the spring, one series in the fall. And in order to do that, we brainstorm ideas. We take a look at conference presentations, be they CoSA, SAA, best practices exchange, regional archival associations that we think would be of interest to state government archivists and records managers who are dealing with electronic records. We also run the occasional survey, send out emails to the CoSA membership and ask them to share with staff. And we also take into account the post-webinar surveys. When you close out of this webinar, you will see a brief survey. We always take a look at those results and try to incorporate them into future programming. As Kathryn mentioned, if you have any suggestions for something that we're not covering, by all means, do not hesitate to get in touch with us. Once that brainstorming process is done, we contact potential presenters, schedule webinars, trying to fit slots into their schedules and ours, and then we develop publicity materials that CoSA staff shares via various channels. Some of us moderate webinars. Kathryn and I have done it. Jamie, who is a subcommittee member, is doing it today. And moderation involves checking in with presenters in advance of the webinar, working with CoSA staff to make sure all the necessary logistical arrangements are in place. During the webinar, introducing the panelist or panelists, monitoring the chat box for guidelines, and taking care of any follow-up requests from panelists or from attendees. In addition, we develop training resources, text-based and more lately video. For example, we've developed a bibliography for state archives employees who are new to electronic records. That was based on an older bibliography that was developed during the very earliest phase of the SERI initiative. We also worked on one for digital forensics for state government archivists and records managers. That involves doing research, drafting and reviewing, and if necessary, sending that off to one of the other subcommittees for additional review. More lately, we've been focusing on video. You're going to hear a lot about video in just a little while, but I just want to highlight that Education and Programming does occasionally do a one-off video. The FAQs on BitRot video that Jamie mentioned at the start of the hour is a very good example. And in doing these sorts of videos, we identify and research a topic, draft and review a script, select illustrations that complement the script, record a draft recording, and then review and improve that draft recording as needed. We're currently in the process of identifying and doing preliminary research for a couple of items, so please stay tuned. And finally, we are looking to foster the development of user communities. In my view, one of the greatest benefits of becoming involved in SERI is the fact that it develops a community among state government archivists and records managers who focus on electronic records. At my institution, I'm one of two people whose work centers primarily on electronic records. There are other people who are involved in various ways from time to time. But the main bulk of the work falls on me, and it falls on my colleague Maggie. There are many people out there who are the lone person at their institution who deals with electronic records. But the SERI community is absolutely filled with other people who have known the joy of finding a page box that is filled with floppy disks and optical disks and all manner of other media that I've never actually seen in person before. They're a great source of information. Say if you're using Archivist and you're having problems dealing with something, there are other people in the SERI community who might be able to help you out, who have tips for using Preservica, for using other types of software that some of us use in our work. And so in the interest of fostering the development of community, we're looking at serving as kind of a support for small focused groups who share a particular interest or use a particular solution in their work. And our first attempt to do this is going to be with a group of people we call archivists who code, that is, archivists who use coding or scripting in order to manipulate metadata or perform other tasks. So we've been working on identifying those state government archivists who use coding or scripting in their work. And we've developed a brief survey instrument that will make contact with them And really, we're just interested in seeing how we can help. We don't want to dictate what this community looks like, just more serving as a resource. You know, if you need a listserv, how do we do that? If you need a discussion board, how do we do that? And letting that community determine its own needs. And it is our hope that eventually those communities will generate some content of their own, and of course we will serve as a link to those communities for folks who might be interested in joining in them. In terms of the commitment to serving on education and programming, we do meet twice a month, typically for 1 hour, sometimes less. Kathryn and I don't believe in holding people to a 1 hour meeting if there's only 30 minutes of work to be done. In addition, there might be some independent creation of content, such as a video script or reviewing drafts of things that other people have put together. All in all, I'd say, and Kathryn would say, that it's about a 4 hour per month commitment, sometimes a little more, sometimes a little bit less. And with that, I'm going to turn things over to Nick.
Thank you, Bonnie. So I'm Nick Connizzo. I'm one of the co-chairs of the Tools and Resources Subcommittee. I have been for some time now, either 2016 or 2017, so it's been a while. Much like the Education Subcommittee and others, we meet once a month, but kind of the focus of our work is not really during our meetings. It's kind of the work that we do in between our meetings that is, most of where our effort goes. And thanks to the previous presenters for kind of building me up and building this talk up about what the Tools and Resources Subcommittee does. So I'll kind of jump into it. So essentially, we have three major goals, and if you read these sentences carefully, you'll see that they're just kind of very slightly different ways of saying the same thing, which is to say that we're responsible for aggregating as much as possible, analyzing and categorizing and providing guidance on the work that our colleagues around the United States and all the states and territories, but also federal government, private institutions, educational institutions, so universities, private libraries and archives, things like that. We are taking all of that great work, trying to put it in a context that is relevant for our governmental archivists and our partners as well. So those records creators out there at state and territorial agencies who are, kind of nonstop producing this flood of electronic records and digital content for us to analyze and eventually, accession into our archives. So this effort is, it comes down to a couple of key elements, and the major one is going to be the CoSA Resource Center. So Alan mentioned this during his slides, which is just really started as the PERTS portal a number of years ago, but has since morphed to this resource center, which if you visited today, it has more than 500 different resources that, whose classification might vary from, specifically education and training materials or standards for all different types of, digital preservation activities that one might be performing, metadata standards, et cetera, et cetera. There's policies and guidelines. There's actual links to websites and the GitHub pages for the actual tools and the scripts that people might use. And of course, there's, we highlight the many, many web resources that are out there. And ultimately, the vast majority of these resources are not those that are produced by CoSA and SERI, though some of them are. They're the ones that are produced by the various different states and territorial archives, as I mentioned before. So it is very much our belief that, a rising tide lifts all boats, and truly we know that archives around the country are not exactly replete with resources and staffing. So anything we can do to more efficiently bring the best practices and techniques from around the country to our individual institutions, that just benefits everyone. It raises not only the standard of practice in this country, but it also allows us to collaborate in ways that we otherwise would not be able to. So the Resource Center is where a lot of our efforts go. We, on a yearly basis, review every resource in there to make sure the links aren't dead, first of all, and obviously more technical stuff like that to make sure they're all still there. But more importantly is to make sure they're timely, make sure they're relevant. We know that the profession and the technologies and the techniques that we're using are very different. I've been a digital archivist for almost a decade now, and what I learned in library school and what I'm doing today are very, very far apart. And that's just natural. That's just going to be true for us because we are dealing with emergent technologies. We're dealing with new tools that our records creators might be using. So we need to make sure that the resources are not only available, but also timely and relevant. So in addition to that work, we're also trying to make these resources as easy as possible to use. So we do cataloging, classification on them. Whenever there is a dearth of resources in a particular category, we try to make sure that we can find some and we analyze and vet them to the best of our ability, though we specifically say that we're not necessarily endorsing any of these resources. We are relying on the great work that our volunteers and our collaborators have done to actually say, these things are valuable, these things are useful. But ultimately, it's going to be up to the individual user to decide how and when to implement them. In addition, some things that other folks have mentioned already. So we have been working on and are authoring, did the Digital Best Practice Series. This year, we're working on one specifically focused on the grant application process, so everything leading up to the point that one applies for a grant. So that's getting your institution ready, preparing your staff and any of your collaborators and partners for what you might be doing, getting your ducks in a row, so to speak, and how to actually find and apply for grants. So obviously that's something that's going to be very much on everybody's mind over the next year or two as we continue to go through this pandemic and the related fallout from that. So we're hoping to have that out in the next couple of months. By the end of the year, such that it will be timely and relevant, as I've said before. Additionally, it's been mentioned a couple times now, but we're big collaborators on the SERI education videos. So ours are mostly focused on highlighting just a bevy of tools and techniques for, metadata classification, cataloging, electronic records transfers, things like that. And we're trying to really take, the best that our various states have to offer in terms of data management, in terms of actually doing this digital preservation work. Our goal with these videos, as has been alluded to, is that they're not supposed to be in-depth, deep dives, super technical. They're supposed to be accessible not just for the end user who might be a digital archivist or even just not, just an archivist, but it's also for the records creator as well. The idea is to understand what our process is and how we do it, and be exposed to something that you might not have thought of, or that might be new. Lastly, though not leastly, we are supporting the various ongoing IMLS efforts. So Alan mentioned a bunch of the documentary work that the various volunteers from SERI are producing. So whether those are publications that are co-authored with NAS or NGA, we try to do a very thorough both procedural and technological review of those documents. So it's our job to say, does this represent the best of the knowledge that we have about how to manage email, how to manage social media accounts, how to manage transitions, when it comes to record keeping. So our job, kind of writ large, is to say we're aggregating all of the best knowledge we have in this country and trying to make it available to the broad audience that we do. But the truth is that ultimately, we're not necessarily going to be perfect at that. We only have access to the information that is given to us through our volunteers, through our collaborators. There's always more information out there, so we're constantly on the lookout for new resources, new tools, new techniques, new best practices, new standards, new guidelines that everyone is using, whether it's in a public, a government context or not, because we want to make sure that our profession can kind of keep up with the pace that government and the public expects us to. So in general, I think I'm going to be giving a general conclusions about the State Electronic Records Initiative, but really, as it says up on this screen right now, our focus is improving digital preservation, electronic records management, and access to those preserved and managed records across the country. We're not saying that we're perfect, but we think we're doing an okay job, but we can always do better. As I said before, technology marches onward. So it's our job to keep up with it. So whether it's big data or, cloud computing or blockchain technology or whatever it is that is, coming into its own as an emerging technology, it's our job to understand it, be able to articulate how the best way is to deal with it, not just today, but 10, 20, 50, 100 years from now, because we deal in the realm of permanent preservation of electronic records. So how can we do this better? What gaps are we missing? We know that especially during this time, there's been a lot of upheaval in terms of government workplaces, access to information, the actual access to physical and electronic records. So if there are gaps that are out there and which ones there are, we'd love to hear from you all, from your colleagues, from anybody who has a need to use public records, how we can kind of cover those gaps. So I will toss it back to, I think I'm going to toss it back to Jamie, but if there are any questions or any discussion topics, the floor is for the audience, I suppose.
All right. Thank you so much to our speakers. I know I learned a lot today, and I'm sure our audience did as well. If anybody has questions, you can feel free to enter them into the chat box.
I think we need to share out a way that people can contact us if they have suggestions or questions.
I think that's a great idea. That was going to be a question that I had, actually. So what would be the best way to contact SERI if people have questions or suggestions or an idea for a resource or something like that?
Yeah, so this is Alan. I can put my contact info down here in the chat. I'm always available to talk. Or I believe if you, I don't have it off the top of my head, but if you do email the general CoSA email, I believe that would work as well. But I'll put my contact info down here.
Great, thank you. While attendees are thinking of questions, I guess, is there a particular resource or video or something in the Resource Center that has gotten particular use or good feedback?
Yes. So this is Nick. I would say that we got a lot of good feedback from the Digital Best Practices series. We put out a guide, as Alan mentioned, a couple of years ago about digitization project management. This was really directed towards not necessarily the kind of line of business staff that would actually be doing digitization, but this was more directed towards administrators and managers, and that really can be for any size institution. The goal was to say, if you have analog records, or records in a paper format or microfilm or whatever it is, when is the right, how do you actually make the decision when it's appropriate to actually do a reformatting project? And if you are going to do it, here are all the things that you need to think about. I can strongly recommend those documents, that and the upcoming best practices document about kind of grant applications, because our goal is to, we're targeting an audience that doesn't necessarily have a lot of experience. So it would be really valuable for really anybody in the field who is thinking or encroaching, kind of coming upon that problem. And the whole purpose is for it to be shared broadly. So I know that when I was digital archivist for the state of Vermont, I know that our Secretary of State got shared that document from a totally different, another secretary from a different state shared it back to him, and he shared it with us as, have you seen this? And I said, yeah, I've seen that. I wrote it, So it's that type of word of mouth, that putting out a good document, that those types of things can be really valuable for us. So that's why we're going to continue plugging along on it.
Yeah, thanks. Any other questions from our attendees? Or maybe everything is 100% crystal clear?
If anybody is interested in joining one of our subcommittees, we would be more than happy to get some new members.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I'd like to second that. We, on the Advocacy and Outreach Subcommittee, have been, we've had a pretty solid roster of participants for the last few years. So I think it's really a great time and a great opportunity to get some new blood on the committee.
And in case anyone didn't see in the chat, Alan Ramsey put his email address in there and also a link to the CoSA SERI webpage. All right. Well, unless anybody has any last-minute questions, I know the panelists are happy to answer later via email. So thank you, everyone, so much for attending today. Thank you to our presenters. And as Bonnie mentioned, you're going to receive a brief survey after the webinar. If you would fill it out, we'd appreciate it. And stay posted on our offerings on our website, Twitter, and Facebook. Thank you.
Thank you.